Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar sponsored by the Anglo-Israel Association. My name is Eylon Levy. I am the translator of The War of Return, written by Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf, who are both on this call with us now. Adi Schwartz is a researcher and former writer for Haaretz. Einat Wilf is a former member of Knesset for the Labour Party, and together they wrote the book, The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. And in this book, they make the case that the main obstacle to peace between Israelis and Palestinians is not the settlements, which is something we hear rolled out very often in the international community. It's not the question of Jerusalem. It's not the question of security. It really does come back to the question about whether both sides, and specifically the Palestinian side, are willing to accept the existence of a Jewish state in any borders, or whether they ultimately really believe that one day the Palestinian refugees and the descendants of the Palestinian refugees from 1948 will be able to return within Israel's sovereign borders. So even if we have a two-state solution, there'll be one state that's Palestine and another state that is Israel, that the Palestinians expect to have free access of immigration. So the case that this book makes is that the Palestinians really are very serious that this is how they see the conflict ending, and that by indulging this obsession, this Palestinian dream, the West therefore has been directly funding and fueling and keeping the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on life support. So we're going to continue for about half an hour, 40 minutes in conversation with Einat and Adi. And then we're going to open up to audience questions. You're welcome to submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. I'll see the questions and then I'll be able to pose the questions to the authors. So Einat, Adi, thank you very much for joining us. And the first question I want to ask you really is, it's a very provocative subtitle of the book, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. That's quite an allegation that you make against decades of foreign policy and received wisdom in foreign policy circles in the West. So why don't you start off by just explaining to us what the big thesis is? Why has the West been keeping the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on life support by fueling this Palestinian dream of return, and what is this dream all about?
Yes, me?
Please.
Okay. Basically both Adi and myself come historically from what you would call the Israeli peace camp. I was a member of Labour Party, worked with Shimon Peres, with Yossi Beilin. Adi was a senior editor at Haaretz. And we grew up and very much believed in the central thesis of peace that was for many, many years and still governs much of the thinking of the West. The idea that the path to peace is land for peace. What Israel has to do to make peace with its Arab neighbors is hand over land, specifically the land captured in the Six-Day 1967 war, and in return, Israel will have peace. With respect to the Palestinians, the thesis is Israel has to end its military holdings, occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, no longer Gaza, but the West Bank. The Palestinians should then establish a state in those areas, and this is the path to peace. And we very much believed it, and we supported throughout the 90s and beyond the various efforts that were made by Prime Minister Ehud Barak and later Prime Minister Ehud Olmert to offer the Palestinians a path to peace based on this land for peace formula. And both of us as Israelis were, and especially Israelis of the peace camp, were devastated when Palestinians again and again walked from clear, distinct opportunities to have a sovereign, independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, to end the occupation with no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, followed up, of course, by waves of violence. And we asked a question that many Israelis asked, what do the Palestinians want then? And we realized that the answer was staring us in the face. The Palestinians wanted what they've always wanted, and have actually said quite clearly, Palestine from the river to the sea. They've been saying it very recently as well. One Arab state from the river to the sea, no sovereign state for the Jewish people in any borders. Now, this particular idea is at this moment manifested in what the Palestinians call the right of return, which in the book we show is neither an international sanctioned right, nor is it by now a return. But what the Palestinians believe is that millions of Palestinians, descendant from the hundreds of thousands, but by now only few tens of thousands are living, the original refugees from the 1948 Arab Jewish war, that they have a right to settle inside the state of Israel, thereby turning it into an Arab majority state. Now, the Palestinians can demand that, can dream of that, can want that, but what has especially angered us, and this is a key element of the book, is that this Palestinian dream, hope, goal is indulged by the West, by the United States, by the UK, by the European Union, through their annual funding for decades now of an agency called UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, which essentially keeps alive for Palestinians generation after generation the idea that millions of them, despite having been born after the war, despite having been not displaced by war, despite the fact that they are already settled in the West Bank or Gaza or citizens of Jordan, are somehow refugees from Palestine and will one day return to that Palestine that will stretch from the river to the sea. And our book is very much in, a kind of accusation against the West for averting its eyes from the very clear fact that Palestinians are very serious about this idea, that they expect it to happen, if not in their lifetime, then in 2, 3, 4, 5 generations, and that the West, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps not, by funding UNRWA, is basically providing political support to this Palestinian idea, therefore keeping the war of 1948 alive, and therefore preventing the possibility of peace, because the war of 1948, certainly in Palestinian eyes, is still very much an open case.
And just on that point, Adi, I mean, you did really very in-depth original historical research for this book. Having gone back into the archives, how do you explain then the decision within the world, in the international community, to support the establishment of UNRWA and to keep funding Palestinian refugees generation after generation, instead of allowing that refugee crisis to go the way of many of the other refugee crises that followed the Second World War and the massive upheaval that unleashed? Why, historically, has this issue been kept alive for so long?
So in the first place, the plan of the Western countries, and here I'm speaking mainly about the United States and a little bit about the UK, their first plan was basically to resettle the Palestinian refugees and to reintegrate them into the economies or to the countries, the places they fled to. This was the habit and the custom, as you say, just after the World War II. If you look at the example of the Marshall Plan in Europe, that was exactly the plan, to use massive amounts of money to recreate jobs and to build houses, to bring people back to their lives, and to put an end to the war. That's it. You're going to back to your life and go on with it. And in the beginning, UNRWA was a very temporary agency. It was thought to be an agency of 18 months. The initial plan was to finish everything in 18 months. But here was the problem. The problem was that from day one, the Palestinians themselves, and this is an important point because sometimes people tend to think about the Palestinians as, pawns, which were somehow manipulated by extreme leadership or by corrupt Arab regimes. This is not the case, unfortunately. The problem is with the Palestinians themselves and the Arab states and the Arab societies and populations that from day one decided that they are not going to be resettled, they are not going to be reintegrated, they are not going to cooperate with the West with this project of reintegration, of putting an end to the war, because just like in Europe, the plan was, or the idea was, to create new lives, to create better lives, and to put this chapter of the war behind us, looking forward into some kind of a peace, or at least some kind of cooperation. And this is exactly what the Arabs and the Palestinians didn't want to do. As Einat just said, when the war of 1948 was finished, unfortunately, the Arabs didn't come to terms with the consequences of the war. They didn't say, okay, you know what, we tried to, undo or prevent the creation of the state of Israel, but now that it's here, okay, we have no problem but to live with it. No, in various measures and all across the board, you can see it in all Arab countries and within Palestinian society, that the decision was to never recognize Israel. This was the beginning of the concept of the Nakba, right? The catastrophe, the defeat to the Jews and the creation of the Jewish state, that for the Arabs was something that they couldn't live with. They couldn't go on with their lives. So here come the Americans and the British, want to pour millions, tens of millions of dollars and create new houses and create new jobs, and effectively telling them, this is in their eyes, forget about the war, forget about this Jewish state, that's it, you're not going to change this. And this is something exactly that the Arabs decided not to agree to. And that was the moment when the West had to make some kind of a decision, right? We detail in the book that as early as the beginning of the 50s, right? Not now, 70 years ago, in the beginning of the 50s, we already found, for example, the American ambassador in Amman, in Jordan, writing back to Washington and telling them, hey guys, this UNRWA is a sham. It's nothing good is going to happen here. The Palestinians themselves don't cooperate with us. No Arab state is cooperating with us. This is a waste of money, waste of energy. We have to stop UNRWA. We have to do something because this is not working. The problem is that we're talking about the days of the Cold War. With all due respect to Israel, with its 1 million citizens, and the Palestinians with their 700,000 refugees at the time, the Americans and the British had much more important and wide global interests, such as the global war against the Soviet Union, against what they were fearing as the communist intervention in the Middle East. And in order to, or at least this was the plan, okay? This was the American plan, that in order to keep Arab states less angry about the West, they tried effectively to bribe them through UNRWA. Now, this is not some kind of a theory that we just throw in the air. This is something that is we found in the documents. So this is something that American State Department, ambassadors, et cetera, are saying clearly, we know nothing's good is going to happen because of UNRWA, but we don't want to anger the Arab world. We found meetings of Saudi ambassadors, for example, actually threatening the United States, saying, listen, you made one mistake with the partition plan. He actually means the November 1947 decision of the United States and other Western countries to support partition. Okay, so you already did that mistake. This is the Saudi ambassador telling to the State Department, don't do it again. Don't do another mistake and cancel UNRWA or take the funding away. So for the Arab world and the Palestinians, supporting UNRWA is actually much more than the money. It means that the Americans and the British somehow accept and recognize the whole Arab narrative towards the conflict. And when I say Arab narrative, I mean that somehow this was an unjust creation, the establishment of the State of Israel. Therefore, these refugees must return. Again, all this is inside the Palestinian narrative. And this was the reason. So when Einat and myself, when we were looking at the documents at the end of the 50s, when the Americans thought, okay, we should close down UNRWA. And the decision eventually was not to close down UNRWA, to continue with UNRWA. And I was asking myself, okay, why was that? Can we find anywhere, for example, the argument that this is the best way to, improve the lives of Palestinians? No, you don't find this argument. Is this the best way to settle refugees somewhere? No, you don't find this argument whatsoever. The only argument that you find there is a political argument, an inner American decision to not alienate too much the Arab state. So this is the historical background for this, ongoing perpetuation of UNRWA, which in many ways is the same till today, with all the changing of, the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the end of the Cold War, but this inertia has just continued, and we are still with that same temporary agency.
It's fascinating to have a look at the realpolitik behind an institution that many people now consider just part of the fabric of international institutions. I want to ask you, your book, I mean, it's a provocative thesis in that, you challenge a lot of people and tell them that they're wrong and essentially doing a lot of bad in the Middle East. And it's come under a lot of criticism. I think one critique that some of our British audiences may have seen was from Peter Beinart in The Guardian. Peter Beinart, of course, former liberal Zionist, now very, very much post-Zionist, whose vision of the Jewish future is Yavne, a small yeshiva world surrounded by a hostile imperial presence. I don't think I'm caricaturing his position by depicting it like that. And he writes in his Guardian article, A Jewish Case for the Palestinian Right of Return, that first of all, who should understand the Palestinians' dream of returning, like us who dreamt of returning for 2,000 years? And if they don't have a right to return 70 years later, what right do we have to return 2,000 years later? And he uses that to support his case for a Palestinian right of return, essentially the end of the state of Israel. I'm reminded, if Yair Lapid is already in the news as not the next prime minister, but the one after, when asked about his refusal to divide Jerusalem, he said, we waited 2,000 years, the Palestinians can wait 2,000 years as well, if they want possession of Jerusalem. But I'm also reminded of, I think it was Danny Dayan, former leader of the Yesha Council, Consul General in New York, now on Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope list, who said, I understand Palestinian nationalism precisely because I'm a Zionist, precisely because I understand how powerful this dream is for us. I understand why they don't want to relinquish that dream, why that's so difficult. What do you make of that argument, specifically coming from that Jewish perspective?
So first we'll plug, basically Beinart gave us homework when he mentioned in his long read in The Guardian that he read our book. That was like, and I think even called it an influential book. So we kind of like, people said, okay, so you have to respond. So Fathom is going to publish our long response. But the short of it is two elements. One of the main arguments we make is first is, after Peter read our book, he clearly now understands that what Palestinians want more than ending the occupation, more than having no settlements, more than having East Jerusalem, is return. So in many ways, he finally understands that this is the issue, that it's not—
You're saying he understands that when all the protesters in Paris and UC Berkeley are chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they literally mean it. It's not a metaphor.
So we finally got to that point. But what he still fails to understand is that and this is where it breaks down the comparison to Jews and Zionism, is what he fails to appreciate is that the Palestinian vision of so-called return was never an innocent one. It wasn't just something, okay, people wanting to return to their homes. We show how the idea of a Palestinian demand to settle inside Israel was subservient to the political goal of continuing the war of 1948 by other means. So as Foreign Minister Bevin said when he passed the mandate back to the United Nations in 1947, he basically says very clearly, the British government, His Majesty's government, understands the conflict. There's an irreconcilable conflict, that's his words, irreconcilable conflict. The Jews want a state in the land. The Arabs want the Jews not to have a state in the land. So this is before anyone is displaced, before there's a single refugee.
And Bevin, is worth stressing for a bit of historical context, wasn't exactly a big Zionist or a big lover of the Jews.
To be very subtle about it, not a friend of the Jews. So And he gets it. And that's before anyone loses a home, before there's any war, before there's any refugee. This is the fundamental element of the conflict. The Jews want a state in whatever borders they can get. The Arabs want the Jews not to have a state in any borders. This is why there's war. This is why the Jews accept partition, because it fulfills their goal of self-determination, at least in some borders. And this is why Arabs and Arab Palestinians reject partition, because it doesn't fulfill their goal of preventing a Jewish state in any borders. And it actually explains the side's behaviors to the present. That's what leads to the war. So Palestinians only develop the idea of return when they fail through war to eradicate a Jewish state, and they ask themselves, okay, how do we continue? How do we achieve our goal of eradicating a Jewish state? Well, there's an economic boycott. We'll continue wars, right? There's 67. We'll have more wars. We'll have terrorism, and we'll establish this idea of return. And in the book and also in the article, we'll show a lot of very clear statements. So the Palestinian idea of return is not some just simple longing of simple peasants. It's a political idea subservient to the question of how do we undo the establishment of a Jewish state. The Jewish idea of return is also subservient to the political goal of Zionism, which is self-determination in the land. For Zionism, the idea was for Jews to rule themselves. To that end, given that Jews were mostly in exile, Jews had to immigrate. But because the goal of Zionism was self-determination, the Zionist version of return did not insist, like the Palestinian one, on each and every square meter where biblical land was ever mentioned. In fact, the Palestinians were repeatedly given the opportunity to exercise the Zionist version of return. In the Clinton parameters, they could have had their state and had an immigration law where Palestinians would immigrate to the Palestinian state. They rejected it because their goal is not self-determination for Palestinian Arabs in part of the land. Their supreme goal is for the Jews not to have a state. So what you have is two political goals that are exactly opposite and irreconcilable, and each side's version of return is basically subservient to those political goals. Zionism wants self-determination in part of the land, so therefore Jews should immigrate, but it doesn't have to be every square inch. Palestinians want the Jews not to have a state, so for their version of return is only to the state of Israel and nothing else will do, which is why the idea of enabling Palestinians also one step further is Palestinians are not only really interested in settling in Israel as peaceful citizens, that's what Beinart imagines, and this will settle the grievances. What we show in the book is that what they want is for the Jews not to have any power. They're not interested in this notion of peaceful return. So the idea that even that will be enough fails to understand the long war, the political goal that really was the goal of the Arabs for the last century at least, which was to prevent Jewish sovereignty in any borders and by any means possible.
Adi, having done all this historical research, how do you feel when you see people like Peter Beinart making that claim for a right of return, perhaps not understanding the belligerent context for it, seeing exactly where it has come from and how it's been weaponized throughout history?
Yes, I think it's exactly true what Einat said. Something that has to be emphasized again and again to understand well the conflict. Sometimes people think that we have two peoples here, the Jews and the Palestinians, and each one of them wants to be free or to have their own country. Now, if that were the case, this is something which isn't necessarily mutually exclusive. You can take the piece, you can take the territory and divide the territory. You can divide water, you can divide many things. But in our case, the Palestinian goal is not to have their own freedom, as Einat just said, because that was offered a few times. The plan is to not allow that the Jews would have their own freedom or their own self-determination. Now, these two cannot go with each other. Now, someone has to give, right? Either the Jews give up or the Palestinian Arabs give up. Now, this is exactly the idea of return. We're giving examples in the response that we're writing, looking at the way Zionism has evolved in terms of their demands. If you look at example at Dr. Chaim Weizmann when he went to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and you look at the map that Zionism wanted, right, to have for the national home for the Jewish people, then you see that it includes not only the state of Israel, the current state of Israel, plus the Gaza Strip, plus the West Bank, and even some parts of southern Lebanon and the eastern bank of the Jordan River, which is now in the Kingdom of Jordan. So basically much more than Israel has today. That's 1919. But as events unfolded here, and as soon as 1946, which is only 27 years later, so perhaps one generation, when you look at the map that David Ben-Gurion suggested to the Anglo-American Committee in 1946, you already see that David Ben-Gurion suggests a partition of the land, and he suggests all the biblical, all the great historical areas, Judea and Samaria. This is the area where all the biblical great events of Beit El and Shiloh and the first temple, etc., etc., etc. All of this, David Ben-Gurion himself suggests would go and to be established as an Arab state. So you look at an evolution, as Einat said. The point wasn't necessarily, in the book of Genesis or in the book of Kings, Jews or Israelites were once here, so we must have this exact house, right? Or this exact place. No, the idea was to create modern country, to be safe for Jews who live here today, and not necessarily go back to the same homes. If you look at the Palestinian demand of return, they insist on going back to the specific homes. So for example, which as we know, do not exist anymore. But for example, Bill Clinton suggested that the Palestinians could go back to their homeland, which could be a much more, or a term that could be interpreted as going back to Nablus, Ramallah, or Gaza, any other Arab city. By the way, as many Jewish immigrants done in the 50s and 60s, millions of them came from Arab countries and from Europe, and didn't necessarily insist on going to the Temple Mount, right? They didn't say, okay, if it's not the Temple Mount, if it's not Beit El, I'm not, I declare war and it's never enough for me. No, that's not the way the state of Israel works. So there's a huge difference between the way, first of all, the purpose, the goal of this return, and how it unfolded in practical terms.
Okay, I just want to remind viewers, those who are still with us, you're free to submit questions while we're speaking now. You don't have to wait till the question and answers session at the end. Any questions you have, you can pop them in the Q&A function inside the Zoom, and we'll get to them in a short while. It's impossible to look at the question of Palestinian right of return simply as a historical issue when we look at ongoing political developments. Right now, Israel's just come out of another round of fighting with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and doing the rounds on social media during the recent conflict was a piece that you wrote a few years ago saying it is impossible to understand the situation in the Gaza Strip. It's impossible to understand Hamas without realizing that about 2/3, 3/4 of the population of the Gaza Strip consider themselves refugees. And therefore, as far as they're concerned, their home in the Gaza Strip is just a temporary staging post until they're really able to return to their grandparents, great-grandparents' homes in what is now Israel. Can you elaborate on that? How do you see the question of the Palestinian dream of return playing into the ongoing crisis with the Gaza Strip and with Hamas?
So first of all, Eylon, what I take from all this discussion is we're adding you to the team of people to speak about the book. You're just summarizing everything beautifully. Perfect, really. You're an Uber
I have to
translator.
say, I have to say that it's very dangerous because I end up becoming very persuaded, very convinced by any book I translate. So if anyone wants to win me over to their worldview, they need to ask me to translate their book, and that's it's a done
Exactly, and
deal.
then they get the plug. So indeed, we've been now stuck in a wall in this kind of rounds of violence, and then with Gaza, and then people talk about what's going on there, and the people versus Hamas, and another round of, okay, how do we rebuild Gaza or reconstruction, and so many good nations offering funds. And a lot of what our book is about is trying to get the world unstuck from wrong ideas about what the conflict is about, and therefore what needs to be done to resolve it. And our main argument throughout the book, if you misdiagnose what the conflict is about, if you think it's only about settlement or occupation, then you're always going to offer wrong remedies. You're actually going to continue to fuel the conflict by doing things that support the Palestinian maximalist worldview. So in Gaza, you really see it. About 2/3 to 3/4 of the people who live in Gaza are registered by UNRWA as refugees from Palestine, and they see themselves that way. Now, this is Gaza. Israel has no territorial claims on Gaza. We left it in 2005. We can all agree that it's Palestine. So you have now generations of people, by now a 5th generation, who have been born in what is agreed with everyone is Palestine. And yet they consider themselves and are registered by an agency that has the UN letters in its name as refugees from Palestine, even though they've been living in Palestine, born there, living there their entire lives, never displaced by war, but they view themselves as refugees from Palestine. Now, which Palestine, if they're in Gaza? Of course, in their view, very clearly, from the river to the sea, the Palestine that will one day stretch from the river to the sea and finally erase this humiliating stain of the existence of the state of Israel. Now, generation after generation is born and raised and living in Gaza under the belief that where they live at that moment in Gaza is not their real home. Their real home is beyond the borders where Israel is. That's the home which was unjustly taken from them in their view. So generation after generation is basically raised to the idea that they have to take back, in their worldview, their home. Gaza is not their home. Now, if you're told again and again, and you go to a school of UNRWA, and this is how you're raised, that where you physically are is not your home, and that your so-called real home has been taken from you unjustly, and that your goal in life, which would give it meaning, is to take back that home, then imagine that now you receive cement. You're not going to use that cement to build a beautiful home, a permanent home, in a place that in your view is merely a midway camp until you take back your real home. You're going to use that cement to build tunnels from which you can hopefully take back your real home. You're going to use whatever resources are given your way, not to turn Gaza into the Singapore or into the Dubai of the region. You're going to use it in order to continue to wage war against the usurpers of what you believe is your real home. So all the money that's going to go to Gaza is guaranteed to go down the drain again and again and again, and to fuel more wars and more rounds of violence, unless the West finally wakes up, stops fueling that, and tells the Palestinians, look, we need to hear from you that you understand that you're not refugees, that there's no Palestine from the river to the sea, and that your future is in Gaza, next to Israel, not instead of Israel. Once we hear from you that clear message that you want to build your future wherever you are now, then we can start sending you all the money in the world so that you can build a beautiful future in Gaza. But as long as you hope your future will be to replace Israel, then clearly all the money will go to that goal. And if we don't deal with that root cause, we're just fueling more rounds of violence. And one of the reasons that I think both Adi and I are so frustrated is that the Westerners, the Europeans, the Americans, the British, who feel so good about themselves, about funding reconstruction, are just funding more war, which we pay for. They don't pay for that in London and DC and Brussels. We pay for it. And that's why we're kind of angry and frustrated about the complete misdiagnosis of what's going on.
Adi, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think perfectly put.
Well, listen, there's so much going on in the situation in Israel now that the conflict with Gaza isn't even the hot story. Of course, because last night we heard the extraordinary news that Yair Lapid, the centrist liberal leader, has managed to form a government that will be headed by the religious nationalist Naftali Bennett and will include the Islamists, the Ram Party. I don't think anyone ever thought that coalition negotiations in Israel would depend on what the Shura Council of the United Arab List was going to have to say, and that they would end up deciding to go with the former leader of the Settler Council, but really we live in extraordinary times. But this is, I mean, this is a real chimera coalition that is going to be formed from Meretz and Labour on the left, all the way to Israel Beitenu, New Hope, Naftali Bennett's Yamina, which literally means to the right, on the right, with centrist parties inside it, and with the Ram, the Islamist parties as well. And I think that's left quite a lot of people baffled, thinking, wait a minute, but what can they possibly agree on when the single biggest issue on the agenda is obviously the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? How are they going to make any progress? Now, of course, they've decided that they're not going to do anything dramatic on that front. But Einat, Adi, how do you understand the recent political developments, this political realignment, with perhaps an understanding that has developed in Israel about the nature of this conflict and the realistic prospects for solving it? Because we're not quite having the same debate that we were having 10, 20 years ago.
Einat, do you want to start? Or?
I'll start. So I think one of the reasons that such an insane coalition could even exist is precisely because the biggest issue, which the world assumes is the biggest issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the left wants to end the settlement projects, Yamina supports the settlers. How could they live together when this is the biggest issue? And the reason is, of course, is that there is a broad understanding in Israeli society today that indeed there is no possibility at the moment to negotiate a peace agreement with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians as a people continue to be very much attached to the ethos of from the river to the sea. And whatever you say about even Meretz, the left-wing party, they also don't support from the river to the sea. They actually still would like Israel to exist. So there is a broad understanding that essentially Israel is not facing that choice because there's no one on the other side that is forcing Israel into that choice. There's no Palestinian leader, and for that matter, barely an op-ed writer, who will come forward and say, the Jews have a history in this region. They are equal claimants to this land. Therefore, we need to divide it with them. And we want to sit down and figure out how we divide the land between the two equal claimants. Let's sit down. If there were such a Palestinian leadership, clearly it would break apart any such coalition, because that would redraw the battle lines between the Israeli left and the Israeli right. But at the moment, after several decades of failed negotiations where Israelis basically understood, not that everyone did the research of our book, but they viscerally understood that if Palestinians repeatedly walk away from clear and distinct opportunities to have their state next to Israel and follow it up by brutal waves of violence, then we should listen to them when they say that what they want is Palestine from the river to the sea. This is clearly, from our perspective, as Foreign Minister Beva noted, irreconcilable. We cannot agree to forgo our independence, our sovereignty, and therefore it's a moot issue. And because it's a moot issue, you can have a very broad coalition that can say, we're not going to make any decision on it, betting that they're not going to have to face any decision on this issue.
Adi, as Einat said at the beginning, you both come from the Israeli peace camp, the left, often known as the disillusioned left. What do you make of the decision of Meretz to sit in a government led by Naftali Bennett? I can't believe I'm saying these words. It still seems very surreal. In the context of where the Israeli political debate has moved about the conflict and the understanding of perhaps what the Palestinians' intentions are and Israel's room for maneuver.
So first of all, I can tell you that on a personal level and as an Israeli citizen who's a bit tired of going to the polls one in a few, half a year or 3 months.
Oh, it was fun.
No, I had enough. So at this stage, to be honest, any government at this stage is better than going on with elections. So I'm good with whatever they can suggest. At this stage, I'm with it. But I think Einat is right in the sense that the differences between, certainly if you look at the main centrist, perhaps Meretz is a little bit, really still think that at this moment, an agreement is possible. And on the other side, if you look, for example, at the religious Zionist party, they would really perhaps want to annex all the territories, all the West Bank. But even from Yamina, from the party of Naftali Bennett, who's supposed to be the next prime minister, you see that they're not really interested, certainly not in annexing all the territories. And I think that the difference between, and even, by the way, if you look back to the time that the Israeli government considered to annex part of the Jordan Valley, there wasn't really any difference between Netanyahu and Gantz, for example. At some point, they even argued who is more in favor of annexing the Jordan Valley. So there weren't really any ideological differences between two biggest parties in Israeli parliament. I think the difference between these personalities, such as Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, and Benjamin Netanyahu, is different. It's not ideological. It's not in their positions. It's more in the way they project power. They would like to project power. And it's more about posture than about positions. So the way Benjamin Netanyahu would like to be perceived is different than the way perhaps than Yair Lapid would like to be perceived. But to be honest, their views and the optimism that they have right now and their analysis of where the Palestinians are and the Israeli chances right now at this moment have any chance to reach comprehensive peace agreement, I think both of them think that the chances are zero. So it's more in terms of how they present themselves and less in their real positions. And this is what makes this government work, or that we will see. And of course, you have to add a little component, personal component of politicians who would like to change the current government. But this is something small that they're not really interested. It's only in the sidelines.
Yeah, I want to pivot to some of the questions that we have coming from our audience. Use the opportunity as well to invite those who are watching to send questions for Adi and Einat. The first question we have is from Ruth Saunders. She's asking, opponents of Israel like to point out that a majority of Palestinians support a two-state solution. That's something we hear over and over again from supporters of the Palestinians. What do you make of this? I mean, as far as they say, we accepted Israel's existence back in the Oslo Accords with the exchange of letters that gave mutual recognition. It's over. It's Israel that's not recognizing the Palestinians.
So that's exactly the issue. I mean, that's what we thought, right? That's what we thought in the 90s. It's over. They recognized, let's move forward. Let's partition the land. They can have the West Bank and Gaza, a state, East Jerusalem. It's over. And then we saw that they walked away from all these, and that's when we began to ask questions, and that's when we realized that what they said, we need to listen and understand. So I used to work with Shimon Peres during the heyday of much of that, and he had this phrase that said that peace and lovemaking should be done with, closing your eyes. You don't really need to, at least with your eyes half closed. It's better not to see everything. Now, I don't know about lovemaking, everyone to their own, but in terms of peacemaking, I've moved all the way to moving from what was called constructive ambiguity. There's now this movie, Oslo, Displaced. It's all about this constructive ambiguity of the 90s. Let's fudge the things. The most important thing is that the sides will move forward. I now am a massive proponent of what I call constructive specificity. We have to be super clear about what we say, because when Palestinians say two states, most people, most Westerners, as most Israelis of the peace camp are, great. What's the problem then? And then you realize that they have this little caveat where, okay, and the right of return, but no one ever asks them about that. No one ever takes it seriously. So two states plus the right of return, which you described very well in the beginning, means an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Arab state which will replace Israel through this mechanism of return, which will turn Israel into an Arab majority state. So the vision of peace for Palestinians has always been one Arab state from the river to the sea. When they say two states, they basically just meant two Arab states. What we've never seen, not for a single moment, even through those years of negotiations and so-called recognition and mutual recognition, there's no moment when Palestinians envision a peace where there is a Jewish state next to an Arab state, as the United Nations envisioned the path to peace. And this is sadly still the case. So when Palestinians say two states, most of the work stops there, but we say, ask them about the right of return. And here, this is a consensus. This is the broadest consensus of Palestinian society. They will tell you that the right of return is a right, that it's holy, and that it belongs to each Palestinian individually, and is therefore non-negotiable and cannot be negotiated away on behalf of the Palestinian people. But this literally means that there's no place for a sovereign state for the Jewish people anywhere, and we're back to square one of what the conflict is about.
Adi, something you want to add?
I want to add something. You can use a rule of thumb that usually Israelis, if you go back to the days of Tzipi Livni and Ehud Olmert, they would always use the term or the phrase, two states for two people. Meaning that there would be one state, Israel, which would remain a Jewish state or the nation state of the Jewish people. And then there would be another state, the Palestinian state, the nation state of the Palestinian people. But this is never the phrase that the Palestinians use. When we noticed it, you immediately understand that, when you listen to Palestinian speakers, it's not a coincidence. They never use this same phrase. They only say, two-state solution or two states living side by side peacefully. So here you don't have any content into these two states. They just live side by side peacefully. It doesn't say anything about their nature. It doesn't say anything about them still being the nation state, as Einat just said, one of them for the Jews and one of them for the Palestinians. So you can, if you listen to what the Palestinians themselves say, you can understand what they mean. They never use the term two states for two peoples because they don't want Israel to be the state of the Jewish people. They say it very clearly, so they don't use the phrase two states for two people. So this is something that you have to learn to listen to what they actually are saying, because they are saying what they want. So it's not a secret for them. They're just using phrases that perhaps Western listeners don't know exactly what they mean, or what they don't say. So this is a rule of thumb. Whenever you hear the phrase two states living side by side, peacefully next to each other, it means that they don't mean what we mean in the term two-state solution. It's not the same thing. It only matters what do you mean when you say the two-state solution.
We have one question here. It's a very flattering question. I always feel embarrassed to ask it. Why don't we see you three coherent and eloquent speakers regularly on our screens presenting Israel's case generally and specifically the case of the right of return? You're clear, persuasive, and convincing in your arguments. Einat, why don't we see more of you? And maybe I'll direct that question towards asking, the question that was, why does Israel seem to have a Hasbara problem? Why does it seem to have a problem presenting its case?
So to answer, the answer is actually in the question. I used to joke for many years, not a joke really, that the New York Times will only publish two kinds of Israelis. Those that say that Israel is terrible and those that prove it. Basically, and that's it. So, if like you're a right-wing nut from Israel, you'll get published in the New York Times because that's great. That really makes their point for them. But if you're a coherent, moderate voice that wants peace, but actually talks about Palestinian intransigence, it's going to be very difficult to get a hearing. And Adi and I can attest, we've tried repeated times, including, responding to Beinart in the New York Times where he published the first piece. Very, very difficult. We do our best. We publish books. We speak. We're active, Adi on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. But generally, we find that our message is not a message that fits into the boxes that people want to have about the conflict. And that's all. That goes to the question of Hasbara. I have a long-running dispute with a non-Jewish friend of mine who really talks about what a miserable failure Israel is at Hasbara and how Palestinians are so good at it and they appeal to emotions and they're really good. And my argument is not that they're good, it's that they just discovered what so many before them have discovered in history, is that there is nothing that you will say about the Jews that will not be believed. So they'll throw out apartheid and people be like, sure. They'll throw out genocide and people are like, yeah, sounds about right. And so I don't think they have this brilliant strategy. I think they've just discovered that they can say anything and it will stick. But that's my view.
Can I add something? So first of all, as Einat said, first, thank you very much for your flattering comments. And we do try to do as much as we can. But one, there is an overarching narrative for the last 20, 25 years in which Israel is a strong state. Palestinians basically only want to have their freedom. By the way, if you sum up the Palestinian narrative, what do the Palestinians want? Everybody knows. Free Palestine, right? 2 words. Free Palestine. This is what people think. Palestinians only want freedom. Now, if you want to summarize Israel's narrative, what would it be? When you listen to Israeli speakers on CNN, on BBC, I find it sometimes hard to understand what they're actually saying. What is the conflict about? What is their narrative? So on the one hand, you have someone who's saying free Palestine, which is something which is very easy to connect to, and everybody wants freedom. So, it's very easy to feel empathy. And then you have someone who's saying something about security and something about the Iron Dome and something about Sheikh Jarrah and something very incoherent. So I think there is problems. Again, Einat is right in the sense that everything that you would say about Israel would stick, but still I think that it's not exactly that we could do a better job, but sometimes I feel that many Israeli speakers don't really have a very clear and central understanding of what the conflict is about. Now, another thing that I would like to mention is that something that Einat and I discovered during our research is that in those 73 years and actually 150 years of conflict, there were so many layers upon layers of lies that when you're starting to say the truth, you're actually doing the work of an archaeologist, because there's so many issues, like we just discussed, Eylon, in the beginning. How was UNRWA even created? The Palestinians used the term right of return, right of return, right of return, again and again and again. Everybody thinks it's a right. Now, all of a sudden, you come and say, okay, actually, it's not a right. So people ask you, what do you mean it's not a right? It is a right. Everybody's sure that it is a right. So you start to feel these, layer and layers and layers, and the job is much more difficult. So if you add everything, the tendency of the media, the narrative that is, when you look at what many people in the West, the Americans have their own issues with racism and the view of the world. Europeans have their own issues with colonialism, etc., etc. Everything that they project onto this conflict, and plus all the lies and all these difficulties. So you have a very, very complex task. But again, we're trying to do the best as we can.
If I might,
Einat, I just want to ask one last. I want to get to one last question because we're just getting up to the top of the hour, and if we can try to keep it short. And this is a very good forward-looking question, a note on which to end. With the Abraham Accords now, Israel achieving peace and normalization with 4 Arab countries in the last year, do you see any prospect for the Arab world now to help the Palestinians accept reality and move on? Do you think that there has been a paradigm shift, not from the direction of the West, from the direction of the Arab world, if we could try to keep it brief?
Yeah. So I'll just say that this is the greatest hope that I have these days. Adi regularly gets emails and tweets from me saying, look, these days I have far more hope from the Arab world than I do from the West. Because, by the way, the Arabs actually know what the conflict is about. They know what it's about. So they know exactly what role Palestinians have been playing in this conflict. They know what's been fueling it. So there's no illusions there. So when they decide to pull back, they do it in a way that no Westerner would dare. They say things very clearly. So I do think actually this is the greatest hope we have. At the end of the day, if this were only an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it would have been over as it was in April 1948. In April 1948, the conflict is pretty much over. It's clear where the Jews are and where the Arabs are. It's only when you have 5 invading armies after the British leave and Israel declares independence that it becomes an Arab-Israeli conflict. If it could be brought back to size, if the Arab world would essentially move away from the blanket support it provided to this conflict, the Islamic world more broadly, and if the Western world would at least wake up a bit, then the Palestinians would finally be forced to make peace with Israel, not based on a maximalist vision of from the river to the sea, but from a more realistic vision of how can they build a state next to Israel rather than instead of Israel. And this is the hope I see. And this is where I'll just add something in the end about Hasbara and PR and all that. Yes, moments where like this few weeks seem terrible, and the Palestinians are very good over time in mobilizing support for their cause. But what happens? Because their cause is the eradication of Israel, they ultimately fail. They get all the sympathy from the world, but then nothing happens because they don't use that global sympathy for a constructive cause of building their own state. We, with much less sympathy, have built so much. And I think that's exactly the difference. Once Palestinians are forced to change their goal from eradicating Israel to building their own state next to it, they will find that they can achieve it very quickly.
Adi, final word?
Yes, I was also very, very encouraged by the Abraham Accords. And we've been hearing people who are saying, oh, it's not that important. You don't really have a conflict with them. And until you solve the problem with the settlements, et cetera, no, it's not true. We did have a conflict with them. The conflict that we have is not with the Palestinians. Of course, we do have a conflict with the Palestinians. They are our physical neighbors. But the main problem that we had for 150 years, that the Jews wanted to create their own state amidst an area which is largely Muslim, largely Arab, stretching from Morocco in the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf, with hundreds of millions of Muslims around us. And then the end of the day, for more and more Arab countries, of course, if they could be important, influential, Saudi Arabia, of course, and other important countries, to say, okay, that's enough. We're not going to continue and fight against Israel and the Jews. And the problem with the Palestinians itself, again, as we just said in this last hour and in so many other plans, is solvable. The moment you want to solve it, it's solvable. So I hope that in this administration or in the coming years, this process of more and more Arab countries coming to terms with the existence of the state of Israel. And by the way, it's astonishing. If you look at the way the UAE, for example, is celebrating the Independence Day of Israel, or mourning the day when Israel mourns their soldiers. This is something which we never saw, not in Egypt, not in Jordan, certainly not with the Palestinians. So it seems that something really deep is changing. I'm here optimistic. I hope I won't be, let's hope for the best, right? We hope for good things. But at the moment, it looks like the best track, and I hope it would continue.
Okay, on that note, Adi, Einat, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion and very good for me so long after translating this book to be able to catch up with you on what has happened since. Adi, where can people buy The War of Return, the Western Indulgence, how Western Indulgence, the Palestinian Dream, has obstructed the path to peace?
So you can buy it on Amazon. There's also a physical copy and there's an electronic copy. And I just wanted to add that it's a beautiful translation, and I think it was translated beautifully by Eylon. So this is my personal.
Thank you. So, so viewers, welcome to buy the book. Also, Adi and Einat have written a lot around the book, as well as you say in the forthcoming edition of Fathom as well, your reply to Peter Beinart. So on that note, thank you to everyone for listening to us. Thank you for the excellent questions. Adi and Einat, thank you very much. And of course, the Anglo-Israel Association and Yaakov Ashkenazi for setting up this event as well. We hope it's been very informative. And since it's a Thursday night already, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.